The life of Hoxie's 4 is numerous, however, the spotlight is of course shown upon the primary enemy factions that directly interfere with the dwarves, which kind of leaves the rest of the organisms lacking in their development. Even so, this video will aim to cover those lesser species and the pathogens that afflict them all. In the original video, this mostly functioned as a kind of really long lightning round, and so in this video it will serve a similar purpose but now be a bit more fleshed out. With that being said, let's get into this biological analysis of the miscellaneous creatures in Deep Rock Galactic. The loot bug is one of the most common and cutest species we see on the planet. A docile decapod which mostly resembles a generic grub. We see it grazing all across the topsoil of the caves in Hoxie, searching for its primary food source, shale. Now, sometimes Earth organisms will eat some hard minerals to supplement important elements for their survival. However, many of the common organisms in the caves of Hoxie take this idea to the extreme by getting all of the nutrients they need to survive from the consumption of silicates and shale. In the loot bug's particular case, it will often consume shale, which tends to fill its insides with what us humans and dwarves would consider precious metals. But this isn't just a byproduct. Instead, the loot bug uses this to its advantage, as any wildlife who attempts to eat it will quickly find that this creature's size doesn't match its calorie count, with most of the bulk coming from chunks of gold and nitra and the like, which also make it a very toxic thing to eat. There's also a separate species of loot bug brought about by a mutation which seems to make it primarily feed on deposits that contain gold, increasing the yield of gold one would receive upon killing it. This mutation is possibly similar to that of the Crassus detonator. Our next organism is the fester flea. This is a bog-standard organism which can be seen across Hoxies in high numbers. It is a quadrupedal, insect-like organism who, judging by its name and the appearance of its mouth structure, likely adapted to feed on blood or otherwise liquid produced by other organisms. However, it is also said to consume most of all organic matter, regardless of the source, which creates big issues for the ecosystems of Hoxie's 4. Now, this thing really shouldn't be capable of flying, as its wings are the farthest thing from aerodynamic. However, it's possible that they contain a similar gas that the Nyadocyte species has, with that ability to unnaturally fly being a common adaptation which came from a common ancestor of all living things on Hoxies. This will later be reinforced by even more organisms with this ability. Now, something interesting about this unit is the similarity it bears to none other than the Mactera genus. Not only does it seemingly also have the same direct flight system that all Mactera species have, but it also has similar glowing eyes, similar spike structures on its leg, and it's a quadruped similar to the Spawn, Brundle, Trijaw, and Goo Bomber. The fester flea appears to be like a cute little bug at first, but it is in fact quite invasive and is known to vigorously breed their population to unreasonably high numbers, too much for the ecosystem to sustain, and getting in the way of the dwarves' mining operations by swarming and clogging their mining equipment. Oftentimes, dwarves sent down there will be secondarily tasked with forcefully removing these from the environment. The maggot's name is a deceptive one, as they are in no way even close to true maggots, only resembling their form. In reality, this organism, or should I say organisms, is truly a collective of symbiotic zooids cooperating in a way similar to Earth's siphonophores. They are said to make ventures to and from the desolated surface of the planet, feeding off the solar radiation before going back down into the caves, presumably to reproduce. To be honest, if this thing weren't a collection of smaller organisms, it would be difficult to distinguish the line between this and a plant, seeing as it feeds on solar energy. Because of this, I think it would also be fair to say that it's heavily likely that the maggot at least somewhat feeds on detritus, as constant long ventures to the surface for photosynthesis doesn't really seem like the most plausible solution. Rather, it may be that these journeys are conducted in order to get the energy needed to reproduce, likely through a form of mitosis or sexual reproduction through the formation of a zygote, which will then result in the growth of a bunch more little zooids, and thus another independent colony. Large journeys like this make a lot more sense when for the purpose of reproduction rather than general nutrition. The carnivorous larva, as its name suggests, might be a larval form of something, but we don't really know. It searches for anything biological to burrow in and nest in, where it will then rapidly multiply. The dwarves' shields and armor seem to be capable of repelling them easily, but the same cannot be said for the rest of the species around Hoxie's. Once they've burrowed, it's pretty much a matter of time before whatever they've burrowed into perishes and releases a bunch of the larvae to go and repeat the process. The parasite itself is a writhing mass, appearing very similar to the rockpox larva. They have a free-form amount of shifting tentacles, and interestingly, they also seem to have an array of some kind of bioluminescent organs towards their posterior. The reason for this I'm not too sure, although it's possible that it could be to warn any predators of their potency. While this is a parasitic organism, it's possible that unseen predators with optical capabilities who would put up a good fight and maybe avoid being infected due to that fight would want to avoid the carnivorous larva altogether. By extension, the larva would want those predators to avoid them, and thus this bioluminescence would be favored by natural selection. Our next organism on this list is what is known as the BHA barnacle, and I truly do not know what BHA stands for, so I will henceforth be calling it the barnacle. Now, similar to Earth barnacles, this is something of a parasite, although it poses no real harm to the dwarves nor any local megafauna, instead attaching to the terrain and likely only targeting microorganisms. It seems to have independently developed what seems like a beak though, which might have you think otherwise. However, I don't believe this is a true beak. Instead, it likely evolved as a sturdy opening so that the creature within could breathe and eat. Speaking of, this barnacle, as its name suggests, is essentially a creature which has almost entirely converged with Earth barnacles. It's likely that they came from a very small invertebrate species which became adapted for the consumption of a certain kind of microorganism. Over millions of years, eating these populous microorganisms became easier and easier to the extent where developing a stationary lifestyle was simply the most evolutionarily beneficial, evolving into a yellow, maggot-like organism which entrenches itself into the local geography, encasing itself in a tough armor to protect itself from any external threats. Plenty of barnacles can be seen anchored all around the caves of Hoxie's. However, in recent times, many of the barnacles have entered what the Miner's Manual dubs their estrus cycle. Essentially, these barnacles have an analog to what we on Earth would call heat in Earth mammals. This cycle lasts decades in these barnacles, which has led their populations to skyrocket. Ordinarily, this would be fine, as again, they don't do much to disrupt the food chain, likely only feeding on passing microorganisms and possibly whatever small organism happens to run into them. However, this is an issue for Deep Rock, the company, as the barnacle's growth warps the rocks around them as they entrench themselves, which, according to the Miner's Manual, can actually cause cave-ins, reducing their accessibility to the local resources. Of course, as a result of this, now many dwarves are sent in by Deep Rock with the secondary objective of exterminating any BHA barnacles that they may find on the way to the planet's natural resources. The implications this may have on the environment are variable. Depending on the barnacle's diet, it's possible that this disrupts one of the base trophic levels of the caves. Regardless, the mass killing of a species for the sake of profit would, or at least should, never fly by modern, non-dwarven standards. The hexawing niffer, on the other hand, is a mostly harmless species which is actually solely native to the subterranean biome known as the Azure Weald. It is another quadruped species which seems specially adapted to find food in the notably bioluminescent environment. It's likely to have adapted a larger brain due to a need to better discern its surroundings, being able to use widespread bioluminescence to its advantage. With this, it could more easily feed on the many lush plants of the biome, more effectively find other individuals of the same species to mate, and really just better avoid becoming any predator's meal. Due to their increased intelligence, though, they've developed another, let's say, byproduct of a bigger brain: curiosity. When the dwarves go on their mining expeditions, unlike most species, the hexawings do not run. Instead, they fly around the dwarf, simply investigating its presence. This both contrasts the behavior of things like the loot bugs, which won't even notice if you shoot them, and other ones like the Huli Hoarder, which we'll be discussing later, that run if they encounter any abnormality. In the same biome lives the majestic Mobula Cave Angel, another curious species named due to its distinct resemblance to the Earth genus of rays, themselves known as Mobula rays. The rays of Hoxie's, though, are a lot more unique. See, these rays can fly, and the R&D department at Deep Rock doesn't really know how. My theory, at least, is that it utilizes a system similar to the Nihilosite Collective again, possibly paired with a super lightweight body, although its sheer size may thwart that theory, with it being 2 to 3 times the size of a dwarf, which is at least 8 to 12 feet in length. It seems to have evolved for quite the nomadic lifestyle, gliding across the azure weald at relatively high speeds compared to most other species, and grazing on the lush overgrowth which the biome is known well for. I hypothesize that the life of one of these things is likely to be similar to that of an earth bird, undergoing long migrations across the biome to find a mate or to locate better food sources, with a distinct call which others of the same species will have no trouble hearing. The silicate harvester is another species which again has the ability to fly in some unknown way. This one more explicitly feeds on silicates, using its 5 tentacles to sift through the terrain and locate trace amounts of minerals, and likely detritus and other debris as well. They can be found in the dense biozone, the fungus bogs, and surprisingly, the radioactive exclusion zone, showing us that this really is a hardy form of life. It's adapted to nothing more than an endless toil and search for its food. We see that its 2 outermost tentacles are covered in hard spikes, which it uses to uproot the terrain, using the 3 inner ones to gather and filter through it. Additionally, judging off of its appearance, the silicate harvester appears as if it may be a social creature. I noticed 2 distinct antennas poking out from the front of its body, which it may use to receive pheromones emitted by members of its same species whenever deposits of tasty minerals are found. As we move on to bigger and badder species, we observe the cave leech, an exceptionally dangerous creature which seems to have no other purpose than terrifying the many dwarven miners. In all seriousness, this thing is a serious threat, and probably considered an apex predator of the sub-ecosystems that it inhabits. So much so that it can straight up kill or incapacitate any dwarf that isn't backed by a team. No chance of escape or anything. The only real repellent to these guys is to just look up. Millions of years of evolution have made this thing pretty much the perfect ambush predator for a subterranean environment. It develops in low light areas and will grab up any prey item that gets close enough with its long and skinny but adept tentacle, which serves as the centerpiece of its main body, a small patch of fleshy organic material. Once it reels its prey in, so to speak, 4 lesser developed but still lethal tentacles will sprout from the sides, relentlessly tearing up anything that the leech itself has reeled in. While this thing goes by the name of leech, it honestly shares a lot more in common with the barnacle, even sharing that commonality with an organism from a separate game which has an oddly similar hunting style. How the cave leech expands beyond its present location is unknown to me, although I still do have a few hypotheses. For one, it could spread through some kind of a spore, possibly releasing countless mass amounts of little babies or eggs which float around the ecosystem, attaching themselves to a random surface, with, of course, the lucky ones surviving the most. Additionally, it's possible that this is only one stage of its life, possibly transitioning into smaller, more mobile forms in the earlier stages of its life, similar to the life cycle of a real Earth barnacle. Another anchored being in the caves of Hoxie's, something of increasing commonality, is the Vartok scale bramble. This organism is stated by the Miner's Manual to be a sentient plant. See, on Hoxie's, certain plant-like organisms somehow faced just the right selective pressures and environmental conditioning to evolve sentience. We see that the scale bramble has developed a near impenetrable armor and an acidic bile which it will spit at any nearby threat to its life. Clearly, this plant comes from an era of great strife on the planet, where only those who were truly the fittest would survive, possibly even at some time of whatever the great calamity that ensued on Hoxie's caused it to look like, well, Hoxie's. The scale bramble is in truth what the manual defines as a mycorrhizal organism, a symbiotic relationship between plants and fungus. The core part is the main one of those two. It will relentlessly guard its home from the dwarves, although it seems to ignore any other bugs and the like, possibly understanding that the dwarven operations pose a greater threat to its safety, whereas most other bugs won't even try to eat it. We see that on the inside it developed a variety of small spikes. As if the tough plates of armor weren't enough, anything that gets a bit too close will be in for a very dangerous surprise. But the scale bramble isn't entirely impenetrable. The secondary part of the symbiotic relationship is a variety of feelers that grow across the cave system, allowing it the ability of sensory awareness within the caves. These feelers are much more delicate and have nodules at their ends, which are susceptible to damage, only serving the purpose of detecting prey and not dispatching it. Once those are destroyed, the scale bramble essentially loses its better half, being highly susceptible to damage. We also have another sentient plant species which shares an uncanny resemblance with the scale bramble known as the Korlok tyrant weed. Not only do its armor plates look similar, but parts of it also fire projectiles that share a great resemblance with the scale brambles. The tyrant weed is classified as near-sentient, likely because its niche has allowed it to reduce the energy spent on the development of such intelligence. In truth, this is a network of plants which have evolved symbiosis with each other, being able to work together to kill any threats. It's also capable of extreme and rapid growth, with the center plant essentially being able to command new ranged defense plants to spontaneously sprout from the ground by literally spitting out seeds of theirs from its very core. This is a truly remarkable form of seed spreading, and it can partially be seen on Earth, with a variety of species having their seeds spread out into the wind, but the Korlok takes that to overdrive by essentially giving birth to new plants of a presumably separate species or variation of itself. It's very likely that this Korlok tyrant weed and the scale bramble share a common ancestor, splitting off to fill different niches and different environments. The spitball infector is seemingly the culmination of this kind of sentient plant. To current modern standards, it's impossible to classify it as flora or fauna, with it sharing significant similarities with both of those categories. The spitball infector has a potent bile which it will hurl at any unwanted trespassers in its vicinity, likely being able to locate the position of said abnormality through its extensive roots, which may be able to sense vibrations in the terrain. This thing likely evolved from an organism which was originally a sentient plant, like the scale bramble. Over millions of years, it's likely that this species evolved more and more characteristics of faunal organisms, essentially a flora organism converging with fauna. And if that wasn't crazy enough, the spitball infector is actively evolving, with there already being a variant of the species through mutation known as the barrage infector. This beast has grown large, but short, opting for a more sturdy body plan. This mutation has been allowed to survive in the caves of Hoxes, though, likely due to the significantly increased capacity for the same bile that the previous infector used, although in this case it is consolidated into organic growths that quickly explode when exposed to the air. While it is likely a really big use of energy, it more than makes up for it in pretty much never dying. Like, seriously, the only reason we can even kill these things in-game is because we're dwarves. Any other organism would really just be better off avoiding it, with really the sole exception of the glyphids, since they can just throw armies at it if they wanted to. The stabber vine, on the other hand, we are not too sure of the origin of. Found primarily in the Hollow Bow, a biome which is the result of two actively clashing megafloral titans, it seems to mimic the appearance of one of those titans, which may point towards it being some kind of defense mechanism against anything that can really threaten it. This would explain why it only targets dwarves, as they are the ones harvesting the resources from the planet and the biome, although having knowledge to that extent would be a little far-fetched, as it is in no way stated to be a sentient plant. Instead, it's stated to not even be known if it's a plant or an animal, which may itself imply that this stabber vine is even a part of a separate network of organisms which we simply don't know about. Depending on how long the clash of the megaflora has been going on, it's possible that this may even be a form of camouflage developed due to the presence of the main red vines. It's possible that, due to their invasive nature, no organism was truly adapted to consume those red vines, and as a result, appearing similar to them would be considered a good evolutionary strategy. Moving on to a bit more of the heavy hitters of Hoxes, the Nayaka trawler stands out as a unique organism. See, this thing, primarily found in the sand-blasted corridors, has essentially evolved the ability to quote-unquote swim through the terrain in Hoxes. How it does this is unknown, although no doubt it's related to the tentacles at its front and the countless spikes at its posterior, possibly having adapted the ability to shift the dirt and rock in such a way that perfectly allows it to fit in there. It's also possible that they secrete some kind of natural lubricant, with their underbellies being a bright yellow and dripping with this substance. This ability is highly reflected in its hunting strategy, where it actually uses two claws positioned near the top of its body to restrain prey before dragging it through the dirt. The friction between the stone and the prey item, combined with the trawler's sheer speed, effectively creates a meat grinder for anything caught in its grasp. Interestingly though, the trawler is stated to be omnivorous, which means that this mechanism may not only be for catching prey, but may be exclusively to defend itself, with the energy gained from carnivory being an extra bonus. The reason I say that carnivory may have evolved secondarily after herbivory is actually because of the morphological similarities the trawler shares with none other than the silicate harvester. Yes, while it may seem odd, there are some particularities that tell us that they could be related. For one, they both have a very similar amount of tentacles at their fronts, with the harvester having 5 and the trawler 4. It's possible that one of the tentacles devolved into a different purpose, or was merged into one of the other ones to increase the trawler's geodynamicity, if that's a word. The trawler also has 2 structures positioned at its top, and what else has 2 structures like that? The harvester, of course. The silicate harvester even has a similar ability, with it being able to uproot the terrain with its tentacles to search for food. It's very possible that those appendages evolved into those that allow the trawler to be the menace that it is to anything that dares to oppose it. Our next creature, though, isn't exactly as tough. The Huli Hoarder is an herbivorous species which has adapted the tried-and-true survival strategy of any given herbivore: run for your life. Yeah, once approached by any abnormality, the Huli Hoarder will just run for its life, no questions asked. For the most part, leaving it to its devices is really the best course of action when dealing with these things. However, many a dwarf will likely seek after the many minerals which have been absorbed into its back and skin through the years of grazing off the local flora on rock faces. This likely happens for its own self-protection, so that if something should catch it, the hard minerals lodged into its skin defend it from the jaws of any nearby predators. In addition to this, the Huli Hoarder has eyes mounted in a way where it can get a near 360-degree view of its surroundings from a bit higher of a vantage point, which allows it to be near immune to an ambush. Now, what I find interesting about this creature is actually the similarities it shares with the Glyphid race. It follows a very similar body plan, and while it doesn't have 8 full legs, it does have 2 extra small appendages at its front, which may have actually been devolved from those 2 legs on the Glyphids. Yes, I believe that in truth the Huli Hoarder is a solitary offshoot of a Glyphid, such as the Praetorian, which split off from a colony following a mutation which led it not to have the instinct to develop a hive. Then afterwards, over millions of years, it would become the Huli Hoarder we know today. The Kronar, our next species, while still solitary, are in no way as cowardly. They are a remarkable feat of evolution, essentially being a pillbug on steroids, which has the ability to spit hot acid from its wide, tooth-filled mouth, and possibly the ability to see with 3 sensory structures at the top of their head. In addition, the Kronar also has an ultra-hard shell which covers its back and that can flexibly bend into a circular shape, allowing it to roll around the terrain and ram anything which it may deem suitable prey or a dangerous enough threat. They are found everywhere on Hoxie's but the sandblasted corridors and the salt pits. However, they apparently do make ventures into the latter of those two. We actually get an outlook into the early lives of the Kronar life cycle. Apparently, when this species is young, the Kronar younglings, more accurately nymphs, need an intake of sodium for the development of their shells. For that reason, the salt pits are chock full of Kronar nymphs. This tells us a lot more though, as it may mean that the Kronar species will undergo a mass migration to the salt pits to lay their eggs before returning back to their standard lives, or even perishing on the spot. Something I find interesting about Kronar, though, is certain morphological features that they share with none other than the Mactera genus. Again, it's a quadruped, which applies to all of the Mactera genus but one individual. It has a glowing tail end, which could have come from the bellies of the Mactera, and it has the ability to spit, something unanimous in all but one of the species in the Mactera genus. This is very far-fetched, especially in comparison to the other candidates for sharing a common ancestor with the Mactera, the Flea and Hexawing. However, it would truly be a very interesting bit of world building. Our next organism also seems to be an interesting one, showing us that not every arthropod on Hoxie's has to become a giant bug in order to become a viable species in the evolutionary tree. The Diptera, native to the sandblasted corridors, are a species similar to bees, but with a variety of differences. For one, they're flesh-eating, which actually isn't the craziest fact about them. In fact, flesh-eating bees are actually a real species on Earth, being adapted to feed on the bodies of dead animal carcasses and the like. The Diptera, on the other hand, aren't exactly adapted for feeding on dead flesh. It's more like flesh in general. They will pretty much attempt to attack anything that gets near them, but are only ever likely to be successful with a kill against small organisms, as the countless flesh-eating insects really only cause a nuisance to the dwarves. Regardless of the source, it's likely that the flesh they collect is used for either the production of this green oozing fluid, a possible honey analog, or for the structure of their nest itself, which, believe it or not, can house upwards of 10 million insects. Of course, the swarm sent out to defend against threats looks nowhere near 10 million, so I must assume that a majority of them remain inside the hive, conserving energy and producing great amounts of that substance. The Ossirins are a relatively new species to have been discovered in the depths of Hoxie's. They seem to be analogs to many species of Earth beetles, with them sharing a particular resemblance with the well-known Earth rhinoceros beetle. The Ossirins seem to be partly a colony insect and partly a solitary species, with there being multiple stages of development that interweave between these lifestyles. The first Ossirin individual we know of is the Ossirin Scrab. No, not Scarab, Scrab. Why it's named this, I do not know, but I do know that this unit particularly serves the purpose of defending Ossirin hives, using their razor-sharp horns to stab any enemies that get in their way. Additionally, they have two amber-colored wings which they control through a direct flight system, possibly pointing to even more shared ancestry with the Mactera genus. It really seems like the Mactera have really been the ones to diversify here. The next individual seen within the Ossirins is likely one of a form which it achieves through some kind of metamorphosis, and I think now would be a good time to discuss the origin of their name. See, an ossuary is known as a place where skeletal remains are brought to be stored all in one place, and the Ossirins fulfill this purpose by having the unique property of collecting bones and remains of many species to create their nests. The Ossirin bone collector seems to be the primary force behind the collecting of these bones, with it seemingly having no other purpose at all, running at the sight of any possible threat to its life. It has grown to a much larger size so that it can carry more bones on its back, and its horns have become more tusk-like, allowing it to sift through the ground for such suitable remains. Now, the Ossirins, as unorthodox as their survival strategy is, have actually been extremely successful, to the extent where they've essentially created an entire biome by digging up so many remains, the ossuary depths. This biome kind of serves as an outlook into the history of Hoxie's itself, something which will definitely be investigated in a later analysis. Now, the Scrab and Bone Collector are both primarily found in the ossuary depths, but can also be found trying to expand their nests to the surrounding biomes. There is one Ossirin, though, who does not follow this formula. The Pitjaw seems to be the result of multiple extensive metamorphoses, possibly of a bone collector, which evolves it into a monster of a bug, which hides in wait right under the surface, waiting for any prey to wander into its jaws. Don't let its immobility fool you though. Once it fails an ambush, it will actually burrow away to set up the trap somewhere else. Truly an extraordinary organism. Pathogens are an inevitability of any large enough ecosystem. The reality is that something is always going to try to take advantage of another thing as a part of its life cycle. There are a variety of plagues seen in Deep Rock, with 3 being the standout primary ones that a dwarf may encounter in the wild. The first is the Cursite infection, one of nebulous origin, likely native to Hox's, which there really isn't much information about. The second one is known as ebonite, an infection based on an organic silicate, the primary symptom of which being the complete hardening and petrification of an infected individual. The third and final infection will be rockpox, scientifically known as the lithophage. This is, in a way, Deep Rock's version of the Flood, a virus which is interstellar, being spread through meteorites across planets. This is the greatest of the pathogens on Hoxie's, one which spreads itself through a variety of vectors, especially utilizing the glyphids to spread itself. The Cursite infection is a largely unknown one which has only ever been observed in what is known as a machine event. There's essentially zero information about it other than the fact that, of course, it's a real pathogen. Infected individuals can be lured in with a machine, and Deep Rock's R&D department is interested in retrieving samples of this virus. For those reasons, I can't make a full analysis on these guys, but I can definitely hypothesize. We see that the Cursite infection causes the development of large crystal-like growths, really alien to most things we see on Earth. However, we could assume these things to be analogs to tumors, essentially masses of tissue caused by rapid and uncontrolled cell division brought about by the pathogen. This must be directly related to the way Cursite spreads, possibly by having infected individuals eventually shed some of these hardened tumors and having them get attached to another host. Other than that, to my knowledge, there really isn't much to say about them. The ebonite outbreak, on the other hand, I do have some experience with, and there is much more documentation on it. It is brought about by an organic silicate which itself is known as ebonite. Now, I'm not exactly familiar with the term organic silicate, however, a quick overview of a couple sources tells me that it refers to a silica structure which contains carbon within it. I'm a little out of my depth here, but regardless, as inorganic and dead as it looks, ebonite is in fact organic, and it's developed to the extent where it has a system of spreading itself. I would expect the status of whether or not this thing is really alive is in the realm similar to Earth viruses. They are so simple and self-replicated that they can barely even be identified as a living thing. Exposure to ebonite in dwarves and otherwise normal individuals induces what the Miner's Manual defines as psychotropic effects, essentially affecting the mood and thoughts and feelings of any given dwarf. However, in a few of the glyphid species, particularly the Grunt and Praetorian, it straight up controls their very mind, covering their whole body in a material effectively impervious to all traditional ballistic attacks. How and why this happens is still being hotly debated, the Miner's Manual says, which is understandable, as you would think that it would be applicable to some of the other glyphid species, when in reality it specifically targets the Grunt and Praetorian. Additionally, the other glyphids are not hostile to the ebonite infected ones, even though they are presumably killed upon infection. It's likely that there is some evolutionary benefit for cooperation with this infection, however, the reason for which remains an enigma. The most significant pathogen within the Hoxie's ecosystem is, of course, an invasive one. Lithophage, also known as rockpox informally, is an infection which comes in the form of meteor showers, with rocks drifting through space containing lithophage vectors. Once it lands on a planet with suitable organic life, it will begin rapidly spreading through physical contact, spores, and mutating to fit the environment. The rockpox life cycle starts in a way very similar to a parasite's, with a larval, worm-like individual known as, well, the rockpox larva. It generally comes from the meteors infected with lithophage that crash onto the planet. Its form is really non-rigid, with it shifting in and out of forms with different segments. It's almost fluid in that matter. With this, it will seek out a suitable living organism and promptly infect it on contact, burrowing into it and causing, quote, rapid and irreversible physiological changes, which come in the form of a bunch of blisters and boils made from the infected biomass that the larva and surrounding organisms possess. Notably, the Miner's Manual also says the larvae are incapable of infecting dwarves. This may imply that the larva is not a constant product of rockpox itself, but an adaptation made particularly for the glyphids and other Hoxie's wildlife. Once a larva comes into contact with a suitable glyphid, that glyphid is taken over, and notably, is not dead on contact. this isn't some kind of zombie necrotic virus, and instead, the glyphids are manually piloted by a new set of instincts, kind of like rabies. The blisters will begin to grow and overtake the host, and they'll reanimate the now grayined body. The infection has various effects on those that it takes over, such as the significant hardening of the exoskeleton and skin, the complete removal of pain sense in the nervous system, and a significant increase in pain through the literal crystallization of joints and tendons. Similar to Ebonite, the rockpox-infected individuals in the glyphid race are not in any way attacked by the glyphids around them. Once again, the reason for this I do not know, although in this case it may be a bit more understandable since, like the Cursite infection, at least the form of any given glyphid will remain recognizable upon infection. Now, the particular glyphids who get infected seem to be specially chosen for the spreading of the infection. These are the Grunts, the Praetorian, the Acid Spitter, the Exploder, the Mactera Goo Bomber, and the Nairocyte Breeder. Now, the Grunt is likely infected often due to its commonality, being the most populous of the glyphids. It's likely to just spread the infection more effectively by just having it, and then on top of that, it's given a ranged attack, which also aids in spreading the infection outside of the Grunt's small range. The Praetorian, on the other hand, is most likely infected due to its size and sturdiness, with the infected version being near impervious to damage in all locations but the blisters, and its vomiting attack helps too, being repurposed for the spreading of the infection. The Rockpox also takes advantage of the glyphid acid spitters, using their unique spitting mechanism. It turns this into a long-distance infection vector. The Rockpox-infected Exploder was an obvious choice, turning the glyphid adapted for self-sacrifice into one designed for propagation, literally changing the biological napalm of chemicals contained within it into storage devices for lithophage spores, which it will then spread upon an explosion. The next lithophage-infected unit is actually not a glyphid, which confirms that the version of the lithophage we know now can go cross-species. The Rockpox Goo Bomber was another obvious creation of the infection, with it being able to hijack the Goo Bomber's natural instinct to defend itself as a vector to spread more lithophage. The final organism to be infected with rockpox at the time of writing is the Nairocyte Breeder, which has its internal biology taken advantage of to produce more lithophage larvae. All of these are infected organisms, where the lithophage had to rely on the biology of a separate entity to fulfill its purposes and life cycle. However, the lithophage infection is also capable of forming its own independent and autonomous infection vectors. This primarily comes in the form of the Rockpox Corruptor. This fleshy mass is made entirely of infected biomass, seemingly collected and siphoned from the many infected individuals. This mass of flesh serves primarily to increase the production of rockpox larvae. Similar to the infected Nairocyte Breeder, it will slowly crawl around the environment, spreading shreds of the infection, which eventually grow into egg-like structures that incubate even more larvae. This is probably the most significant vector due to the sheer runoff of the infection it leaves during its natural existence, and the virus itself seems to know this, as if attacked, there will be a harsh response. But how do you fight such a monstrous thing anyway? Well, don't worry, we won't be eliminating all life in the galaxy. Instead, a simple cleansing system was designed just for these guys. Upon calling in a cleansing pod, a dwarf will find a lithofoamer and a lithovac. The lithofoamer is designed to spray a kind of instantly freezing foam, which, when coating lithophage-infected biomass, will either kill it or harden it instantly. Then, following that, you can use the lithovac to vacuum up the foam, taking all the infected biomatter with it. Theoretically, you could eliminate an entire infection on a planet with this system if you had the right resources, although I'm not entirely sure how the foam interacts with the spores as opposed to the biomatter. Due to the emergence of the invasive rockpox, dwarves all over the planet have made a combined effort to eliminate it and preserve the local ecosystems, although this is likely just because rockpox makes it much harder to siphon Hoxie's resources. There is another interesting organism within the caves of Hoxie's known as the core spawn crawler. This organism seems to share little to no common ancestry with the rest of the species here, and its existence as a whole is truly an enigma. However, upon deeper ventures into the core, we'll come to find that the depths of Hoxie's are truly home to some remarkable wildlife. But that's a story for another game and another time. And so, at last, this analysis comes to an end. After 20,853 words and counting, this is without a doubt the longest combined script I have ever written. It ranged from million-strong colony organisms to sentient plants, and throughout it was all some of the most fun I've ever had in the development process of a video, and as this saga has now finally been concluded, we can move on to future projects. Right? I mean, sure, we haven't covered the core spawn or any of the biomes, and I mean, I haven't done the plant life either, and the brood nexus. I couldn't forget the brood nexus. I mean, I guess it's not over, guys. I guess Deep Rock Galactic content will return. With that being said, as always, I hope this video has encouraged you to look at the games you play under a more detailed lens, and if you ever find something that you may find interesting, you can leave a comment below letting me know about it. If you'd like the opportunity to know when I'd be uploading said video, or if you just want to support me in general, you can subscribe to my Patreon. In doing so, you'll get a video roadmap for all future videos that I may upload. If you want to support me in a way that does not involve a subscription though, you can also leave a super thanks in the comments below. However, you will be missing out on certain perks like early access and a shout out at the end of my videos. And with that being said, thanks for watching, and goodbye.